I want to share with you some thoughts that John Buchanan in Feasting in the Word has written. He shares this piece of advice with his readers, saying, "You might approach this story about the wealthy man who entrusts his property to three others by talking to an investment manager or someone who works in what's called the wealth management industry. Ask him or her what you have to do and the risks you must be willing to take to double your money. He or she will, in all probability, tell you about the rule of 72, which most of us have never heard of. How many of you know what the rule of 72 is? Put up your hand. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so 4 of us know what the rule of 72 is. Kent, do you know what the rule of 72 is? Nope. Okay. That's okay. I didn't know what the rule of 72 was, if it had changed at all in the last 25 years. So I called. I took his advice, John Buchanan's advice, and I called somebody that I knew that knew a thing or two about investments and about wealth management. And I called my brother that you saw on screen there. I called him to find out if the rule of 72 still applied in today's market. And he said, yes, as a principle, it does still apply. So here's how it works. I'm going to keep this as simple as I need to keep it for myself, because I am not an investment. I invest in other things, most likely people. But I'm going to keep it simple for my own benefit and perhaps for yours. If you make an investment and it has a guaranteed interest rate of 5%, you divide the interest rate into 72. Okay, so you have your investment, it's at 5%, you take the interest rate and you divide it into the number 72, and the answer is going to be the number of years that it takes to double your money. So if you've got a guaranteed investment, it's at 5%, you divide that into 72, you're going to get 14 and a half years. It's going to take you 14 and a half years to double your money. If you want to double your money quicker than that, what needs to happen is that you need to take more risks, a lot more risk, if you want to reduce that 14 and a half years down to a much lower number. In the world of venture capital, it's only about 1 in 4 or 5, and some people would say as much as 1 in 10 people that are actually able to follow this rule of 72 and to take those dramatic risks in order to double their money in a much reduced period of time. The other 5 or 6 or 9 people, depending on which figure you want to work with, those people pretty much lose out. There's a huge risk that you take. Today's Bible passage tells us about Jesus, who's telling us the story in the middle of his own personal high-risk venture. It was during the last few days of his life. Earlier, he'd made the decision to leave the safety of rural Galilee and to go to Jerusalem, the capital city, where the religious authorities would see him as a threat to their own power, to their own status quo, to keeping things relatively safe. And the Romans would see him as someone who was disturbing the peace, a disruptor of the times. The story's about a wealthy man who goes on a long journey, and before he leaves, he distributes his property to 3 others. It's a lot of money. 1 talent was equivalent to almost 15 years of wages for a general laborer during that time. So 5 talents, let's do the math here, 5 talents equals about 75 years of wages for the average person during that time. That's longer than most people would live back then. Now 75 seems to be relatively young for most of us if you're in reasonably good health. But back then Jesus is using the example of they're being given all of this, which is far more than they might ever accumulate in their own lifetime. We're told that the first one takes the money, and it's like they've taken the money to the market, to a wealth management firm, and invested it in some high-risk ventures. And the second one does the same thing, puts the money to work at a high risk, and both do very well. Both reap the benefits of that rule of 72. Both get 100% return on their investment. And so we hear when the wealthy man returns, he's pleased. Well done, he says. And then he promises that they will receive more responsibility in the future. And we hear about how this third one takes a different approach. His one talent, he digs a hole in the ground, he keeps it safe. And by the way, digging a hole back in the first century in Palestine, to keep your investments safe, to keep your treasured items safe, that was not an unusual thing to do. Jesus is using terms from the time and images from the time that people can relate to. So today we don't hear too much about people stuffing their money under a mattress, and don't put up your hand if you're doing that right now, because we are online, but it would be the same thing. You know, people are digging a hole in the ground to keep their money safe, just like people used to tuck it under their mattress to keep it safe. Jesus is speaking to them in terms and in images that they can relate to. In today's world, if it was a time of stock market decline, this third man would look very wise. He's not a bad person. He's a prudent and a careful and a wise investor. He's cautious. He's not about to take chances with the money. It's all there. Every single part of it is there when the one who gave it to him returns, and he's proud of himself. Here it is, all of it, safe and sound. But if you look at the whole Bible, this one person that Jesus speaks of in this parable is treated more harshly than the majority of other people in the Bible. John Buchanan writes, "I can't help wondering how it would have turned out if the first two people had put the money in a high-risk venture and lost it all. Jesus didn't tell it that way," he writes, "but I can't imagine that the master would have been harsh toward them, perhaps might have even applauded their efforts." I can't imagine that the master would have been harsh toward them and might have even applauded their efforts. The point here isn't really about doubling the money and accumulating the wealth. The point is about living. It's about investing. It's about taking risks. It's about Jesus himself and what he has done and what is going to happen to him and what he will still be doing. Mostly it's about what Jesus hopes for and expects of his followers after he is no longer right by their side. It's about being a follower of Jesus. It's about what it means to be faithful to Jesus. It's a story about you and I. The greatest risk of all, it turns out, is not to risk anything, not to care deeply enough about anything, not to invest deeply and give your heart away. The greatest risk is not to risk at all and to play it safe. Historically, one of the church's ancient vices, deadly sins, was considered sloth. And we don't tend to use that word very often, although I know that Reverend Walker had a sloth-a-thon many years back at Pelham Community Church where she had to just sit and do nothing, which is really, really hard to do sometimes for some of us. But we don't use the term sloth in our everyday language very often. Sloth means not caring, not loving, not rejoicing, not living up to our full potential of our humanity. It means investing nothing and being cautious. It means digging a hole in the ground and playing it safe. Through this story, through this parable, Jesus speaks to us, letting us know that the outcome of playing it safe, of not caring, of not loving passionately, of not risking, of not investing ourselves in anything, is very similar to death. It's like being banished to the outer darkness. And we who are here consider ourselves to be Christians, called to follow the light. We just sang, Jesus bids us shine. We're called to be in and of the light. For many of us who live in a relatively safe country such as Canada, our personal faith doesn't seem to be much of a high-risk venture. We come and go from this church without too much fear for our personal safety. Faith, we think, is no more risky than believing ideas in our heads about God and Jesus, perhaps a list of beliefs which we try our best to uphold. We think that faith is about getting our personal theology right, about just doing the right thing and living a good life. For the most part, our religion and our faith is safe. It's a pretty non-risky adventure. And we tend to be quite comfortable with that. But for at least the last 20 or 30 years in North America, we've heard and we've experienced how church membership is declining. We've heard and lamented about how we don't have 600 kids in our Sunday schools anymore. And we've heard and we've seen how our pews aren't full on Sunday mornings anymore. The buildings are getting older. Our bodies are getting older. There's still work to be done. We still keep rolling up our sleeves. But it seems like the list gets a little bit longer sometimes. And in an effort to maintain our comfort, some of us start to channel our resources, our time, our energy, our finances. We start to channel that away from God's work more towards our own worries and our own concerns. Like the third person who buries his or her talent away in fear of what might happen, we become close-fisted with our gifts that have been given us by God. We close our fists and we keep our time and our talents to ourselves rather than investing and taking a chance. The reality of the world that we live in is that some churches and faith communities aren't quite so comfortable as they used to be. Ours is one of those churches. This faith community is probably not quite so comfortable as it was 60 years ago, 62, 63, 64 years ago when it was first joined together as a faith community. We're not quite so comfortable, and I think that's a good thing. In fact, I think it's a great thing, and I think it's a godly thing that we are not quite so comfortable as we once might have been. Perhaps our discomfort serves as a reminder that the gifts that we've been given aren't meant to be hidden away safely. Perhaps it's a reminder that we ought not to be afraid of the future and worry so much about what might be in 5 or 10 or 15 years ago, and trust that God is going to take care of this faith community and us as individuals, whatever that might look like. Through this parable, Jesus invites us to be disciples, to live our lives as fully as possible by investing our lives, by risking, by expanding our own beliefs, by expanding our horizons. To be his disciple, Jesus says, is not so much about believing ideas about him as it is about following him. It's about experiencing that renewed responsibility for using and investing all of the talents, all of the gifts that we've been given, no matter what form those take. It's about being bold and brave and trusting in the Spirit and believing deep in our hearts and living from that place knowing that we are not alone, that God is with us, that God will provide us, and that we have been given everything that we need to make a difference in our lives and in the lives of other people that live near to us and in people that live even farther away from us. Through this story, Jesus invites us to an adventure of faith, into the high-risk venture of being a disciple, not just today, but every single day. May we choose to live without fear, to remember what we have been gifted to and through Christ. May we live without fear and invest ourselves in the service of Christ today and always. Amen.